Now I want to introduce our host, a lamb and a wonderful historian and professor of film, Foster Hirsch.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. Welcome to everybody for being with us on this special occasion. We are here to celebrate the publication, the very recent publication, May 17th was the exact publication date, of an extraordinary book that we will be talking about for the next 45 minutes or so. My Place in the Sun, Life in the Golden Age of Hollywood and Washington by George Stevens, Jr. George, welcome. And thank you so much for spending this time with us and talking about your book.
What a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. May I ask, George, as an opening question? This book has an enormous breadth. It's very long. It must have taken you, as a writer, I know how much effort and time it took. What was the basic inspiration for embarking on such an epic project?
Well, I think it occurred to me, and I kept notes and papers and all sorts of mementos through the years. And it probably somewhere in the back of my mind, the idea of writing something like this one day occurred to me. And then there came a time when I just thought it was time to do it. And I must say, I was aided and abetted by the misfortune of COVID, because I was at home at a very nice place where we live in Washington, and I had not much else to do. So it was relatively easy to concentrate on the task of writing this book.
As a fellow author, I can join you there. I finished my book under COVID as well. There's something about the isolation that forced you to do it. It was now or never.
Yes.
Yeah. I want to begin with this epic canvas, talking about your ancestors. What's extraordinary, and I think people will be surprised to hear this, your father, of course, the great director George Stevens, came from a family of actors.
That is true. And my mother was a collector, and she saved correspondence from my grandparents, which enabled me to write this correspondence clippings, because this Stevens family in entertainment goes back to my great-grandmother, a woman named Georgia Woodthorpe, who was born in San Francisco after the Civil War, and as a little girl was invited by a great Shakespearean actor to join an acting club. And she became a wonderful star of the stage. And she, it turns out, was the youngest Ophelia to Edwin Booth's Hamlet, the greatest American Shakespearean actor. And she was the mother of Georgie Cooper, Georgia Woodthorpe, Georgie Cooper. And Georgie Cooper married an actor named Landers Stevens. And Landers had his own company in San Francisco and touring. And Georgie became his leading lady, both as on the stage and at home. They were the parents of my father, George Stevens. And so it was Georgia Woodthorpe who really started 5 generations of Stevenses in the entertainment world.
In the entertainment business, in different facets.
And counting.
And counting, yes, and counting. But in different facets, you didn't all do the same thing, but you were all in the business in some fashion.
Right.
Did your father himself have any instinct toward acting, considering that his parents were renowned actors and had their own repertory company? Was he first drawn by acting, or did he want some other aspect of the business?
I found an interview, a tape recorded interview, that when he talked about when he was, I suspect, 12 years old, and he said that the parents didn't have anybody to care for him and his brother Jack, so they would stay at the theater and do their homework at night, and while the parents did their work. And my father talked of a favorite moment of his. And it was when his father would play Sidney Carton in A Tale of Two Cities. And he said on those nights, he would put his books away and he would go toward the end of the play. And he described it so evocatively. And he said he's sitting in the dark under the stage. He would hear his father's footsteps climbing the guillotine. And he said, then he would hear his father's voice. And my father seemed moved in reciting, it is a far, far better thing I do than I have ever done before. It is a far, far better rest I go to. And then he would hear the sound of the guillotine, the crack of the guillotine, and then just the stunned silence of the audience. And then he would hear applause, and he heard the applause, and the curtain furl down and crack the floor. You know, and it gave me an idea of this boy sitting in the dark, getting a sense of how audiences respond. And his father did put the kids in the plays, but Dad he didn't like that because he said we were so often being asked to play parts for which we were too old. So I think he got, because he was a very fine looking man, and certainly people asked why always behind the camera. But I think he got this idea of thinking of himself as a storyteller.
But the family legacy does get into his work, because I've always felt that the acting in George Stevens movies is extraordinary. It's always real. It's always believable. There's always a full commitment from the actors. And when everybody is that good, it has to be that they're getting something from the director. He was a master director of actors. I think up there with Kazan, frankly, in that category, as good as that.
Yeah, so many actors, you know, many of their best performances are in films of his, and he believed in actors, and he had a very quiet way of working with them.
He had his own way. He obviously knew how to speak to each actor.
I remember going on the set of A Place in the Sun at Paramount Pictures. And I was in college, and Montgomery Clift and Elizabeth Taylor were doing a scene, and I was sitting there kind of in the dark watching. And it was in the morning, and my father said, okay, Monty, why don't you go over by the pool table? And Elizabeth, you find a place by the door where you're comfortable and come in, and why don't we just run through it? And they kind of go through the scene, getting a little help from the script clerk, and they finished, and he said, well, that's nice, so why don't we do it one more time? And they would go about their business, and they would do the scene one more time. And then he said, let's just do it one more time. And they did it the third time. And after that, Monty, I remember, came over to Dad, and he started talking quietly to him, and then Elizabeth joined them. And they went back, and they then set up the scene to shoot after lunch. And I asked my father, I said, why did you have them do it 3 times without? And he says, sometimes it's helpful for the actor to know that she needs a little help.
That's a very quiet kind of help, isn't it?
Well, it is, you know, that you're not kind of imposing on them before they have a chance to try their own ideas.
You joined your father. You were at the age when you could be on the set and help him out in the 50s, when I think he had his greatest creative streak. There's an extraordinary progression in your father's career. Before the war, he was mostly known for making comedies. Then he went into the war. He photographed the concentration camps, and he came back from the war determined not to make laughing movies anymore. And there's virtually not a laugh in any of his movies in the post-war period. But it's my feeling that he became an American master only after the war, when he in a sense, erased comedy from his work. Does that seem like a fair assessment to you? I mean, I love the serious George Stevens.
Yeah, I will, we had the premiere of the restored 4K restoration of Giant at Grauman's Chinese about 3 weeks ago. Steven Spielberg, who initiated this restoration, and I introduced it with Ben Mankiewicz. Sitting and watching Giant, it was in the theater where it had been premiered 65 years before. And to see that film on the big screen with a huge audience, an IMAX screen, and to hear the laughter. There's so much humor in Giant, including one scene of mild hilarity when the children are feeding the turkey and then the turkey dinner is brought in and the children recognize their friend Pedro. But, and the Diary of Anne Frank, there's considerable humor. Shane has humor. I would agree with your sensation that, or your view that the work became deeper and the subjects were more serious, but the humor never left him.
The humor left, but the humor in those films provide accents. They're not the focus of the film. As starting out with Laurel and Hardy and Wheeler and Woolsey, he was making comedies.
Right.
These are serious films with light tones. Did he change after his experience in the war? Were you in any position to notice that experience at Dachau had a profound impact on him?
Yes, I was in a position to notice, and how could it not? And it certainly affected his work and his choice of subjects. But as a person, it didn't take the humor away from him. He was not publicly carrying it around.
What's wonderful in your book is to see that you're the son of a Hollywood master who was also a decent man and a terrific father.
Well, I was blessed in that respect. When he came back from the war, I was a year later, I was graduating from high school, and I didn't have a summer job, and he said, well, you can help me. So he gave me 2 assignments. One was to break down Theodore Dreiser's An American Tragedy, parts 1 and part 2, in 2 notebooks, and list every character, every scene. The other, which was the basis for the film he was about to do the screenplay of with 2 writers, A Place in the Sun. The other was to read the stories, the scripts and books that were sent over from Paramount Pictures, most of which were treacly love stories in the view of a 17-year-old on hot summer afternoons. But one day a book came, a small book, a novel, and I read it in the afternoon. And I went to see him that night, and he was in bed reading. And I walked in and I said, Dad, I said, this is really a good story. I think you ought to read it. And he said, why don't you tell me the story? So I found myself pacing around his bed, trying to reconstruct in an interesting way, as I best remembered it, Jack Schaefer's Shane. And the next summer, my first job was produced by that conversation, because I was in Jackson Hole as the company clerk on the production of Shane.
So
and I think it was his way. My father never said, don't steal, or be a good soldier, anything like that. It was all by indirection and example.
But he gave you great opportunities at a young age to help him in works, and every film that you worked on with your father has, through the test of time, which you talk about in the book, proven to be a masterpiece.
Yeah.
Place the Sun, Shane, Giant, and Diary of Anne Frank are all masterworks of the American cinema.
Right. But I think that summer, there was 2 chores he gave me. were for me to find out, A, if I had any interest in his field, and B, did I have any aptitude for it? So it was a very nice testing program.
It sounds like the sorts of things he did with actors by letting them do the scenes over and over again. It's like he's guiding you without appearing to guide you.
I think that's true. You know, you mentioned something, and it was very important in my father's life and in my life, and I'll make it a story. In 1951, I went to the Academy Awards with my father. He drove the car. His actress mother, Georgie Cooper, was in the back seat, and my mother in the back seat, the two of them. And I sat next to him during the awards. Joseph L. Mankiewicz came out on the stage. I believe he was the Oscar winner of the previous year, and he read the nominations. John Huston, The African Queen, William Wyler, Detective Story, Vincent Minnelli, An American in Paris, Elia Kazan, A Streetcar Named Desire, and
Wow.
George Stevens, A Place in the Sun. Well, I probably wouldn't be telling the story other than A Place in the Sun was chosen. And I was riding home, we were riding home that night, and the Oscar was on the seat between us. And I don't know why, but he looked over at me and he said, you know, he said, we'll have a better idea what kind of a film this is in about 25 years. Now, this was before Cinematheques, before DVDs, before streaming. Pictures came and went. But he, in his heart, you know, he'd read Eugene O'Neill, he'd been around the theater. He knew that the important aspect of art was standing the test of time. Now, he didn't know he was talking to the future founding director of the American Film Institute, for which the core idea became the test of time, preserving the films and
That
honoring.
conversation was a pivotal moment in your life.
Exactly. And I remembered it, but only in writing this book did I realize how formative it was, both for what I did and what I aspired to.
But his sense that it was too soon to tell in 1951 how good the film was. It was getting accolades at the moment, but how would it look decades later? We can answer that very securely now. Place in the Sun is one of the greatest films ever made in America.
Yeah.
And so is everything else he made in the 50s, including, George, a film you don't even mention in the book. And I think it's a real discovery. Nobody talks about it. Nobody knows about it. And it's a very good film, something to live for.
Interesting you mentioned that, Foster, because we're now doing a restoration of it.
Oh, really?
Yes. And at the Bologna Festival this last year, the director of the festival thinks Something to Live For is an unrecognized classic. And so the retrospective of George Stevens was called George Stevens, Something to Live For. But it's a picture with Ray Milland and Joan Fontaine. So it's going to have a chance to be reviewed and looked at.
Oh, absolutely. It deserves a rediscovery. It's a forgotten film. People who know George Stevens' career probably would come across that title and say, what's this?
Yeah.
I wouldn't know it. It's a beautifully made film. Joan Fontaine was never better than in that film. It's an extraordinary. And I must say, I had an interview with her, and I was so happy I had the chance to tell her so.
Oh, that's nice. Yes.
Now, I would say you had this career with your father in the 50s, but it was his career and you were helping him out. Something extraordinary happened, which put you on a completely different path so that you could carve your own way. And am I right in saying that next to your father, the most influential person in your life was Edward R. Murrow?
I think that can be said.
Tell us about how important he was to you.
We had just finished The Diary of Anne Frank. I had been his associate producer on that, and I directed all of the location work in Amsterdam.
Which is fabulous, by the way. Be able to say the location work is just terrific.
Thank you. And I had a respectable cinematographer at my side,
Oh, yes.
Jack Cardiff.
Not bad.
And if I can quickly, I'll come back to the story you're saying. But I said, you know, I could only do this if I had a cameraman that I had confidence in. And Jack Cardiff turned out to be available, and he did it. And I flew to Amsterdam, and Jack Cardiff is one of the great people, bon vivant, brilliant artist, great fun. And we planned everything, and we went to dinner the night before, and Jack ordered a fine wine, and then he made a toast. And and he said, there's one thing I should tell you, George. I've never shot a frame in black and white. We were shooting this black and white film. Well, of course, Jack Cardiff could shoot in black and white. He just never happened to have done it.
But those scenes in Amsterdam evoke a war-torn city, a city under immediate threat and peril in more powerful ways than I think I've ever seen in a movie. Those scenes alone have such power.
Thank you.
And they're directed by George Stevens Jr. But that was not to be your destiny.
No, and so at this time,
it changed the course of your life.
Yeah, President Kennedy was elected, and he chose Edward R. Murrow to head the United States Information Agency, the agency charged with telling America's story abroad. And a friend of mine at Fox, we read that Jackie Kennedy was going to India, and ask not what you can do for your country, or your, you know, whatever. And and we wrote a letter to Murrow and said, we'd like to pro bono make a film of Jackie's trip to India. We think it would tell people abroad would see an example of America's care for other countries. And before we heard back from him, we read that Murrow was coming to speak to the motion picture industry at Jason's restaurant, the leaders. And so we sent word that it's the new frontier. Would you like to meet some young people? And he said yes. So on a Friday afternoon, we met at the Directors Guild, about 14 of us. Paul Newman was there, Dick Zanuck, Stuart Stern, Ivan Moffat, and Murrow came in his Savile Row suit, and he was just great. I mean, he's such a smart and articulate man. The next day, I was single. I was at my bachelor pad in the Hollywood Hills, and I got a phone call from Sam Goldwyn Jr. He said, Ed's staying at my father's house, and he wonders if you could come see him on Sunday afternoon. And I said, well, I'd love to. May I ask what it's about? When he said he's looking for somebody to run the motion picture division of USIA. And I quickly said, oh, Sam, I said, I'm like my father's partner now, and we're just starting the greatest story ever told. That I really couldn't do it. And Sam said, I understand. And he signed off, and phone rang 20 minutes later, and Sam says, Ed says you won't be wasting his time. So I went over and sat with Sam in Samuel Goldwyn's Spanish style living room with the croquet game going on outside the window. And we had a wonderful conversation, and Ed asked me to do it. And I gave him the same answer, that I really couldn't. 3 days later, I was with Dad at Fox, and we were walking to the commissary, and we hadn't discussed this, and Murrow came up, and I told him, and he stopped walking, and he looked at me, and he said, I think you may have to do this. And, you know, he was seeing what I could not see, and he was also putting some burden on himself and making me look at my opportunity. And so I did it, and it was a life-changing experience going to Washington.
But wasn't that an extraordinary act on your father's part?
Yeah, that's why I say he's a great father.
Yeah, I mean, what a loving, caring father. He saw what you couldn't see as a youngster.
Yeah.
What that would mean for you. and you went to Washington, and you went to Washington during the Kennedy era, and you've been there ever since. We're talking to you tonight from your longtime home in Georgetown. Am I right? You have been a Washington resident and a Washington power broker ever since that conversation with Edward R. Murrow.
Yes, I was one of the first bi-coastal people because all of my jobs in Washington have being involved in Los Angeles and in the Hollywood community.
So that's my next question. What qualities do you have to maintain a successful career in Washington? And are they the same qualities that you need to maintain a successful career in Hollywood? I think you're the only one who's ever had a foot in both camps for such a long period. So what you say about yourself may not apply to others, but what qualities in you, George Stevens Jr., allowed you to have this long, successful career in Washington?
Well, I think there's a common denominator in Hollywood or in the movie making world. If you want to do creative things, you have to have some combat training. You know, you have to be able to manage and have people see things your way. And I came into this government agency of 15,000 people. Happily, it was at 1776 Pennsylvania Avenue. And when I arrived, I went to my office on the third floor, the corner office, and discovered that Murrow's was on the fourth floor. And so I was close to him. And my job was to make 300 documentaries every year. And the tools were similar. You had to, instead of manage life in a studio, you manage life in a government agency, and having the same issues of the challenges of doing something creative in a studio. You have to persuade somebody. And in a government agency, you were making films and showing films to your colleagues, the regional directors, for example, who are not experienced in film, and you have to persuade them usually that understatement is more powerful than being too explicit.
But don't you have to have a certain set of diplomatic skills to negotiate your way in Washington inner circles, as you've done for 6 decades and counting? You have to be diplomat.
Yeah, yes, but so too, I would say, in Hollywood.
You would say, well, your father was diplomatic, but certainly some of the Harry Cohn diplomatic, I don't think so. I mean,
well, how, dealing with Harry Cohn and Lyndon Johnson are not altogether that different.
Oh, okay. But just to tell the audience, and the book has such wonderfully vivid anecdotes. You ran USIA. You're the founding director of the American Film Institute. You're the originator of the Kennedy Center Honors. You're the originator of the AFI Life Achievement Award. You're the originator of Christmas in Washington. All of these events that you have engineered over the course of so many decades, they're all due to you. You're responsible for preserving our legacy, the test of time, and preserving our films. You have been in the business of honoring the top achievements in the American arts. Did that come from something within you, a legacy from your father or your family? You grew up respecting artists and creators?
I think, yes. I mean, certainly my father's influence, taste, and imagination, or maybe he passed some of that on to me. And, you know, you play the hand you're dealt. And I was in Washington, having done the USIA, and toward the end of it, when I was about to finish, I was also instrumental in the National Endowment for the Arts and its creation, in that when the legislation was first written, it listed 12 arts, painting, poetry, architect, but not motion pictures. And by virtue of my position working for Murrow, I knew Hubert Humphrey, Senator Humphrey, who was one of the authors of the legislation. And I was able to call him, and he immediately understood what an oversight that was. But it's also an indication of how films were perceived at that time. The only two directors anybody, quote anybody, had ever heard of were Hitchcock and DeMille, because they had their special presence. The others were anonymous to most well-educated people, certainly in Washington. And so when they knew what to do, with symphony orchestras and theater, nobody knew what to do about film. You can't give a grant to Warner Brothers. And I was asked, and I suggested, I'd been involved in bringing young filmmakers into USIA to make our documentaries. I'd been going to film festivals and being told of how woeful our protection of our film heritage was. So I had those things going on in my head, and I suggested an American Film Institute, and it was decided to do it, and they asked me to run it. And that's when I had to make another choice. Do I go back to my life concentrating solely on making movies, or do I do that? And I chose to do that.
But you stayed at the American Film Institute for only a limited time, after which you felt it was time to hand over the reins to somebody else.
Right, and longer. I was there for, I'm still there as on the board of trustees, but I was there for 12 years, and that was longer than I thought it was going to take, and to get it stable. But then I really did feel that I wanted to do other things and do my own work. And I also had this idea for the Kennedy Center Honors, which was to be born soon.
Which you produced for, was it 37 years?
Yes.
And you won 15 Emmy Awards, which I think is a record-setting number, probably.
Right. Well, I don't know that it's a total record, but
it's pretty up there.
It was not. It was also, many of them were for the honors, but others for Separate but Equal and The Murder of Mary Fagan, and yes, other things I've done.
Yes, but a number of Emmy Awards. Now, I wanted to. I was interested in the book because you talk about so many famous people. You are so tactful. But there is a subtext. So if you read carefully, you can see that Mr. Stevens really admires this person, maybe this person less so. You're a born diplomat, and you're not a gossip, but you're dealing with these world famous personalities. I could sense when you were pulling back, but you already said something that corroborates what I felt. When we were in the Kennedy period in Washington, you loved Jack and Jackie, and you just enjoyed being with them. You liked them as people, you liked their politics. When the scene shifts to LBJ, your tone changes.
That can be true. I mean, I was in a situation where I had become, and Liz, my wife, and I had become very close with Bob Kennedy and Ethel. And Lyndon Johnson's bête noire was Bob Kennedy. So I was dealing with the Johnson people and occasionally with Johnson. And I could feel, one time I was at dinner, only one time. I happened to have dinner upstairs at the White House with about 14 people. And President Johnson was at the end of the table and I was about 2 down. And those of us of the new frontier, we all had PT 109 tie clasps. And I still have several, that I could feel President Johnson like it was a glimmering thing. And whether he was looking at it or not, I felt he was, that identifying me, as a Kennedy person. But you know, and you say about discretion. There's another thing I learned from my father was to respect the audience and to leave a little something for the audience to do. And you seem to exercise that option.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, I did. You gave me a little bit to work on, and I went much further with it. I was very good. You're an avowed Democrat, even if you don't state it in the book. One certainly feels that you are. So when we shift to Republican regimes, the tone changes. But I was fascinated by the scene of President and Mrs. Reagan coming to dinner at your house.
At this house, yes.
At this very house where we're talking to you from.
And we had little drinks after dinner and this coffee in this room.
And I sense that despite political differences, you sort of liked the Reagans.
I did. They were, I mean, I make no bones about it. I did not like Ronald Reagan's policies, but Nancy is a very, very personable woman, and the president, of course. So yes, I enjoyed getting along with them.
And you had the Clintons in that house for dinner.
Indeed, yes.
And I love the anecdote of Hillary was for dinner and Bill was not coming, but then he was busy, but he came anyway, late.
Yes. It was during a troubled time.
And in reading the book, one really gets a sense in the background of the history of Washington since the Kennedy era. It's not that you don't focus on that, but it's there. Yes, the scandals and the shifts in regimes. What does come through, and which is so sadly missing now, is that in those days, there was a sense of civility. So Republicans and Democrats who might disagree on policy could be in the same room and be civil with each other, and even sometimes like each other personally. That there was an affability, which is not there in the last couple of years, where people are at each other's throats. The country is so divided.
I do write about it. I saw that change, and part of it began when there was this politicians were charged with being too close to Washington, too close to the government, and so many of them started staying at home. Their wife and children stay at home, and they come and spend 3 days a week in Washington. Whereas when I was first here, they were on school boards together. Their kids played on the same teams. They were all living in the same city. And I think that there was that personal relationship doesn't exist anymore.
But the politeness and civility don't exist anymore.
That is true.
It's a city poisoned by factionalism, as it wasn't in the decades that you write about.
Right. True.
A number of years ago, George, when we were talking and I was interviewing you for different events, many years ago, you told me about a young senator from Illinois that it was very important to keep an eye on. Am I right in saying that you were one of the earliest and most vociferous supporters of Obama?
I went to the Robert Kennedy Human Rights Award in, gosh, what year was it? Must 2005, 6, 7, 2005. My wife, Elizabeth, was on the board of the Bobby's Memorial. And there was an event each year in the caucus room at the Capitol where both Bobby and Jack announced for president. And we went on this day, Liz and I, and saw Ethel outside the room, and the speaker walked up of the day, the speaker to be of the occasion, and it was Barack Obama. And we went inside, and I'd met him a couple of times before, but on this occasion, I'd been to so many of those Kennedy Human Rights Awards, which were great gatherings because so many people loved Ethel and loved Bobby's memory, journalists, political people, And I'd seen people speak. Barack Obama that day took Robert Kennedy's ideas into the future. And I walked out and said to a friend, he should be running for president in 2008. And it was a week of the Kennedy Center Honors, and I was very busy, but I went down and I wrote him a letter saying why I thought he ought to run in 2008, not 2012 or 2016. And I was told he's not running for president, but I'd said we'd like to get together. And so we got a date and we did something right here in this room. And he insisted it be to raise money for his 2010 Senate campaign because he wasn't running for president. And right over here, he spoke to a group of people, most all of whom he had not met before, some of them kind of very influential in politics. And I was urging him to run. And by the end of the year, not because I urged him to, but he decided to run. And I was sort of on the ground floor of his campaign. And we started Artists for Obama. And that was a very exhilarating period.
So you saw something in him. You saw real star power, and you supported him to the nth degree.
Yeah, I think more than star power. I thought, you know, I read his book, his first book, which was so full of insight, and you saw his values in the book, and I did think he had the communicative skills to run a good campaign.
Part of the pleasure of the
one
book,
of my pleasant little note in the book. Later, during the campaign, I had written a play called Thurgood, which opened on Broadway.
Which I saw and enjoyed, yes.
And on opening night, my assistant, Dottie McCarthy, came from Washington and she said, there's a message on the office phone machine, you ought to call in and check it. And I called just before the curtain was going up, and I listened to this message. He said, George, I'm just calling to wish you good luck tonight. I think you know if I wasn't running for president, I'd be there.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's a wonderful anecdote. The book is filled with juicy little tidbits of all the Hollywood personalities that you encountered over the years. I want to just bring up 2 or 3 to whet the appetite of our audience. And I encourage everybody to buy this really terrific book, which is filled with history and anecdotes and entertainment and government and political policy. But there are just a few personalities you mentioned that I enjoyed reading about in particular. I'm a huge fan, as indeed your father was, of Elizabeth Taylor. And you have some encounters with her where she's really very flirtatious with you. Is that accurate?
That's not a word that crept into the book, Foster, but we were good friends.
Was she flirtatious with you? You know?
Liz is a charmer.
Yes. And your father got the most sublime performances out of her. Just fabulous.
Yes.
So,
and she served a place in the sun so wonderfully. It was really her first fully mature role, and absolutely. She was just 17.
Yeah, just amazing.
Yes.
Cary Grant and Katharine Hepburn, as you described them, seem sort of like a handful.
Oh, well, gosh, they're both so wonderful. And Cary, really in his later life, we really became good friends, and he would never accept the AFI Life Achievement Award because he had to make a speech. But when we did the Kennedy Center Honors, I felt that the artists should not be asked to speak or perform, to sing for their supper. So that being the case, we ended up calling it Cary Grant's Law. Cary accepted to be a Kennedy Center honoree.
Because he didn't have to speak.
Yes.
But I was interested in how you continued to pursue Katharine Hepburn for Kennedy Center honors when she kept saying no, 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 but you didn't give up.
No, I felt it was very important that she receive it.
How did you convince her?
Well, it's not a short story, and I don't want to, but essentially, I'd called her and spoken to her about it. And she said, no, it would just be too painful, just too painful. And so to get me off the phone, she said, well, you can call me Wednesday, but nothing's going to change. And between then, on a Sunday night, I was watching television, something called Alexander Cohen's Night of 100 Stars 2. And whom do I see walking across the stage all in black but Katharine Hepburn? So I called her and I said, you know, every year, all of these artists recommend you more than anyone else to receive this award. And I say, well, Miss Hepburn's just too private. This is not something she'd be comfortable doing. And now, after they've seen you at Radio City Music Hall, what am I going to say to them? And she said, you just don't understand. It would just be too painful. And I heard words coming out of my mouth that I thought came from somewhere else. And I said, we've heard so much about that Yankee fiber of yours. I said, why don't you just summon some of that Yankee fiber and say yes? And she snarled, yes, and hung up the phone. And she came and she was delightful and enjoyed herself happily.
But that anecdote says something just as much about you as it does about her, that you do have a certain fearless quality. You were in the room so many occasions with world famous people, and you were able to hold your own.
Or impertinent, perhaps.
Were you ever intimidated by the people you dealt with who were the most powerful figure, the most famous figures, among the most famous and powerful figures in the world?
Well, you know, you're certainly respectful and, you know, presidents, but I always was comfortable in talking with them, if I had an idea or a point of view or wanted to ask them to do something in our Kennedy Center honors situations. And I have to think that in part, it was watching my father deal with people, and he dealt with them in such a quiet and dignified and purposeful manner, and could be very strong when it was called for.
That's a wonderful statement. That rings so true after having read the book. Such a tribute to your father. The book is a tribute to yourself, but also to your father. George, you write in the book that one of the richest experiences of your life was working on the Diary of Anne Frank. And how could it not have been? And it's an extraordinary film. But we have in our audience tonight the two of the great performers in the Diary who want to say hello to you and say hello to our audience and have a conversation with you. Millie Perkins, who played Anne Frank, and Diane Baker, who played Margot, her sister. And after all these years, they are still the best of friends. They've just had an evening in California, and here they are. They'd love to say hello to you and to the audience. Millie and Diane, tune in, please. Greet us, say hello. George, we can go to gallery view now so that we can see Millie and Diane.
Can you see?
I see them. I do. I see them too. Yeah. Plus, they happen to be two of my favorite people.
Look at you.
Oh. Hey, George. Hi.
Hi, George. Hello.
Hello. Hello.
We're so thrilled to have this book. Each of us,
I can't wait.
it was like a moment in when you were at the TCM festival, and I had this huge idea. I had to get these books, but I was stuck and I couldn't get to you. And you had handlers and people walking you around, and you had your book signing. Millie got hers today,
Oh.
Diane, thank you.
And I got mine also, and we can't wait.
I can't wait.
We can't wait to start reading.
I'm
Oh, well,
thrilled.
great. Yes.
Millie and Diane, would each of you share one anecdote from
Oh.
working on Diary of Anne Frank, either about George Sr. or George Jr.? We'd love to hear it. Millie, do you have a story to tell
Oh, my
us?
goodness gracious, you'll never get me to shut up. I don't know where to start. I mean, I had never acted before. George Stevens asked me to test for the diary. I said, no, I'm not an actress. They insisted. I went and I met this lovely man. And if he hadn't been a lovely man to deal with on a one-to-one basis, I would have gone home and said, forget it. And I went back east. He flew to New York, came to the, I know the, I forget what hotel that was, the big hotel in New York. What was it?
Sherry, Netherlands.
Where?
St. Regis, Sherry, Netherlands.
Hey, yeah, and George
Okay.
said, meet me there, and he met me for lunch. He said, I'd like you to play this part. And I said, oh, okay, if you like. And so I said, well, I've never acted. He said, that's okay. And it was the most, well, of course, it changed my life. But to meet a man like that with such sensitivity and kindness in him and understanding of who I was a gem of my life.
Diane, did you have a similar
Right.
reaction?
And Foster and George, he changed my life. First of all, just being a person, if you met him anywhere, Millie says it all. He was gentle, kind. He understood that it was our first job ever. I could cry too. Oh my God.
Oh, gosh.
No, it's true. He was the best director ever in my whole life. There's no one that touches him ever. I mean, to the extent of making it easy for us to work. I mean, just a little peppermint can go a long way before a take. A little peppermint to make you feel at ease. And then dailies. I never knew anything about dailies. And he wanted us to be there and to watch what we were doing. And he would comment when we were on camera saying, look, watch, she's really listening. Or on the reverse, one day he would say, you were in acting class, weren't you, last night, Diana? And I'd say, how did you know?
He'd say, forget what they told you. Just don't think about the acting class. Remember he would say that to you?
Yes.
Yeah.
But he forced Millie to go to Nina Foch, which was
Well, he didn't.
That's-
What he did, he hired Nina Foch to help me learn the lines, because I'd never studied act. I'd never learned lines for anything. And he said,
Yeah.
I'm going to hire this wonderful actress to help you learn the lines. And we came onto this, finally, we started shooting. We came onto the set. And now Nina's on the set with me, and she's feeling like she's going to have something to do with it. And then all of a sudden, George said, Palsy, he called me Palsy. He said, who told you to say that line that way? He said, did Miss Foch tell you? I said, yes. He said, don't do it. and Nina left, and we never saw her again on the set. And that was that. He didn't want anyone coaching me, and he knew that I could do it by myself. And he was the one that led me the way.
But you know, Foster and George, this lesson of the diary itself and learning about what happened in Germany and all over across the European continent. I mean, it was just for a young person to have that huge revelation of what went on. It stayed in me now to the point where I'm not Jewish, but I am Jewish, and everyone knows how I feel about the whole thing. To the marches, anything I can do, anything, anywhere. And I just feel like if George was here today, I think he'd be absolutely appalled at what's happening. And I'm thanking God, the people who did something about it, which she did and made that movie and cared so much. He would be appalled, as I'm sure you are, George, is that it's just shocking what's going on. I mean, you'd think, and they show the diary in every classroom across the country and maybe the world, and thank God for that. And I hear it all the time. People are saying that was their favorite movie ever. And so it's important and it will last forever. Thank God. He was a wonderful, wonderful man
Mm.
and a very talented filmmaker. Brilliant.
Well, changed my life, and he was
Mm.
one of the loveliest people I met in my whole life.
Mm.
And one of the most helpful people. And George Jr., you were too. I always loved having you around, and I loved knowing that you were there. Thank you.
And anytime you want us to talk about George and those days, we're here for you.
Well, it's interesting, Millie and Diane, that this racket we're in, making movies, can, in the best of ways, can have tremendous impact on one's life. And none of us would be the same if we had not spent that year making the Diary of Anne Frank.
Yeah.
It's gone with us through our lives, and both in a philosophical way and an emotional way, brought us closer to something we would have never understood quite as well, and did so through the very uplifting experience of making a beautiful film.
You know what's interesting, George and Millie and Diane? Diary of Anne Frank was a film that was made by a Christian director. No Jewish filmmaker wanted to touch that material
Really?
at that time. It
Really?
was too painful. And a lot of Jewish filmmakers and Jewish moguls in the industry wanted to shy away from the Holocaust. It was a painful reminder of being a victim. And it was a righteous Gentile like George Stevens who had the courage to make the first American film about the Holocaust and the concentration camps. And it was an act of courage at that time. Nowadays, after the extraordinary success of Schindler's List, it isn't such an act of courage to approach that subject. But it was in 1958. It was an act of courage to make a film. And it was a non-Jewish filmmaker who did it.
You know, it's amazing to me to think back, because I, having never acted before, and George Sr. saw my photo and he said, I'd like to test her and everything. And I kept saying, but I'm not an actress. And it's amazing to me that man gave to me what he gave to me, because I think back, I don't know what would have happened to my life, and something else would have happened, but it gave so much to me. He gave so much to me. There was a kindness and a humanity in him that I never met before I met him, So
Every time I saw him, Mill, I cried. I walked up to him and I stood there and I couldn't speak. I totally was helpless.
I know.
I lost my words. I didn't know what I was going to say.
George would say, Diane, he'd say, or Margaret, he'd call you Margaret, he'd say, are you okay? And I think, oh God, she's going to cry again. I was tough, and that's what was right for Aunt Anna,
Yeah, no, it's true. I just, as I said, no one has ever come close. And then you watch all the movies that he made, from more the merrier. So many wonderful movies after, of course, A Place in the Sun, one of the most brilliant films ever made, as you said, Foster.
Well, when they asked me to test for the movie, I hadn't thought of being an actress. And then someone said to me, he directed this movie called A Place in the Sun. And I had been in high school when it came out. And I thought, oh, that was my favorite movie of all time. Okay, I'll meet him. That's why I met him, because of The Place in the Sun.
Wonderful.
It's wonderful that all these years later, you two are very good friends. You're sort of like sisters.
Thank God.
You've kept up all these years. You've kept a friendship going from that movie.
Yeah, it's true. It's wonderful.
Wonderful.
And it's like sisters, but there was a family. They're all gone now, Foster.
Yes.
Every single one. I was thinking last night, I've started ticking them off. Oh my God, all these wonderful, talented people. Ed Wynn. I mean, Lou Jacoby, of course, Christy. And I think Meep.
What?
Meep is still alive.
Who?
Meep, who
No,
played
no,
Jody
I don't
Heath.
think so.
Jody Heath.
I'm not
No.
sure.
No,
Uh,
but
Foster, one little, you've heard of John Cocteau?
yes,
Yes.
my favorite.
One little moment in this book is we took the Diary of Anne Frank out of competition to the Cannes Film Festival. Jean Cocteau was the head of the jury.
Oh, yeah.
And
That was great.
when Millie was introduced, he left the jury box and went over in his cape and took off his hat and bowed down to her.
Well,
Oh, Millie, that
it
is so
was,
beautiful.
what was the movie he did? That was my favorite, one of my favorite movies as a
Which,
young
that
person.
who did?
That was not Cocteau did.
Oh.
I was sitting in the audience with you, George. I don't know. And Cocteau came down in his cape and kissed my hand. It was heaven to me. It was heaven. It was just wonderful.
Well, then you can then go to work and start reading the book. You'll find.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Millie, was the film Beauty and the Beast? Is that the one you're thinking of?
Nope. Mm-mm.
Not Beauty and the Beast? No.
Something with
Okay.
black in the title. I don't know. I don't know.
But George, I'm starting immediately to read it. You will hear from me after it's finished.
Mark, do we have some questions from our audience to ask George?
Please.
I have nothing in the chat room. So.
Ask us something.
Ask George something.
It's back to you, Foster. There's no hands.
All right, Foster, up to you.
Okay, I think we had a question from Vicki Wilson, who is George's editor and who's my editor, asking how each of you changed during the course of making the film. I think that's directed to Millie and Diane and George as well.
Well, you called it a family, and it was. And
Except
what?
there are moments when, like a family, you get into areas that are difficult with certain people. You just can't help it.
Well, when Ed Wynn walked on the set, it was heaven.
Heaven.
Yeah, when he was a dream. I mean, everybody was. It was new to me. I had never met actors. I remember was just starting a modeling career, and I was coming back from Paris, and I was looking around, and all these people I was flying to California to test for the Diary of Anne Frank, and there were these people on the plane, and they were all part of the movie business. And I thought, well, what kind of people are these? I've never met people like this before. It was a whole new world to me, and I accepted it. And I wasn't afraid of anything in those days. My father was a sea captain. He was a commodore of 30 ships. What can I tell you? There was nothing to be frightened of with my father around.
Victoria, I think your question is a good one.
What?
Social justice was what I got out of the movie from the beginning. Injustice in the world. I didn't realize how bad it could be. And it was just a shock. So I learned to really be on the lookout for anything that harmed another human being. And it stayed with me to the point, if someone on the sidewalk, something happens, I'm the first there to start to be in the middle of it.
Well,
Whatever happens, no one's going to get beaten down.
no, I'm the same way.
Can I be heard?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, hi. Yes. Hi, Vicki.
Okay.
Yes.
Hi. Wonderful conversation. Foster, George, great to see you. And wonderful to hear Millie and Diane. I'm just curious, George, how did working on that picture change you?
Well, I think I spoke to it a little bit earlier. I guess going to Amsterdam in 1959, my father was on 1957, he was on the jury at the Cannes Festival. Then we rented a car and drove to Munich. And the next day went to Dachau, the first time he'd been back in Europe since the war. And then we went to Normandy and walked the Normandy beaches together. And he told me about D-Day. And then we went to Amsterdam and knocked on the door, or rang the bell of a little office in downtown Amsterdam. And a tall man, whitish hair, opened the door and invited us in. And it was Otto Frank, Anna's father. And he had lost, of course, both his daughters and his wife in the camps. But he had married a woman he met at Auschwitz named Edith. And they were together and they served us coffee in his modest little office. And he was looking at the man who was going to tell his daughter's story. And he was obviously curious and also wanting to help. And at one moment, he went to a filing cabinet, pulled it open, took something out that was wrapped in a cloth and put it in front of the two of us and unfolded the cloth. And it was Anna's diary with the pictures all pasted in and her handwriting, you know, and you looked at these pages and you realized that her voice, Hitler's voice, had been so loud and obstructive. And here, this child's voice, young woman's voice, had sold 40 million or whatever the number of books. And it was just, and he let me hold it in my hands, and it was just so moving to just feel her in those pages. And that's, you know, something. And then we went with Otto Frank. He took us, and the three of us went into the Prinsengracht, to this building, this spice factory with the hiding place on the top that was completely abandoned. And we walked up, and we got to I took a picture of Otto Frank and my father that's in the book, with the window outside. And Dad asked him, he said, "Can you talk about the day the Germans came and the Green Police?" And he told us, he described it. And he said how they took his briefcase, they found it and emptied it out, and money and jewelry and a bunch of papers. And they carefully scooped up the money and the jewelry and herded them out, leaving the papers on the floor. And of course, the papers were this voice that would, in time, take over the interest and conscience of people all over the world.
I have a story.
And how could you not have been changed by the central nightmare that happened in the 20th century? Just for everybody who has not read this book, I want to say this is an extraordinary book. It really is. It's full of wonderful stories. It captures an age. It captures a reach of two fabulous careers. And I loved it from the first moment I read it. And I think everybody else will have a wonderful time reading it.
When I met Mr. Frank, I met him with George Stevens. He introduced me one night. He invited me to dinner at Albert Hackett and Francis Goodrich, who wrote the movie and the play on Broadway.
I was with you, yeah.
Yeah, and George Stevens said, "Millie, would you and Mr. Frank like to go into the library and talk a bit to each other?" It was the first time I met him. And I was nervous, of course, and he was too. And I remember sitting there, and I looked up, oh gosh, it moves me every time. I looked into Mr. Frank's face and he had tears in his eyes. And I was sitting there like this. When I protected myself, when you protect yourself, you put your thumbs inside like this. And I'm sitting there like this, both my thumbs protected like that. And I looked at Mr. Frank and he looked down at my hands and he said, "Anna used to sit that way all the time." And then I got tears in my eyes. It was a moment that I knew. I thought, this is right. He said, Anna sat there like that. And I'm sitting there with him like that. It was a beautiful moment. Never forget it, because it losing right now.
I'm just
All
going to tell one story and then I'm going to mute myself to hear what everybody else has to say. One of the editors, the great editors at Alfred Knopf for many, many years, publisher and discoverer Julia Child, before she came to Knopf, worked at Doubleday. And she used to go through the slush pile. And in the slush pile, she found this book called The Diary of Anne Frank, and published it. And that was Judith Jones, one of the great editors.
Oh my gosh.
She recognized the power of the book. George, would you tell us about, maybe we can end here, your father shot film. It was shot the only color film of the liberation of the concentration camps. And am I correct that that film shot by your father and his crew was used in the Nuremberg trials and is also on permanent display at the Holocaust Museum in Washington?
That is true. And my father and Bud Schulberg, not Stuart Schulberg. Excuse me. Now I'm one of the Schulbergs. They worked together on this film that was shown at the war crimes trial. Yes.
And that footage is on permanent exhibit in Washington at the Holocaust Museum.
Yes, it is. When you come out of this elevator to enter there's this, and it's attributed to this special coverage unit, which my father headed. Yes.
Yes. I mean, I wonder if your father wasn't prouder of that than of almost anything else he did as having the most consequence.
Mm.
But that might well be. I wouldn't know. Yeah.
What?
That's extraordinary.
Yeah.
Oh,
Okay.
Come on, Foster, ask some more.
Two people, you have such an extraordinary career. George Jr., honestly, he would be so proud of you.
Thank
And he
you.
was.
No, truly proud of you, in such a way, I can't even imagine what he would feel today.
Uh,
And
And
writing,
did we mention that and we should end here. Did we mention that George Jr. won an honorary Academy Award in 2012 for his contribution to the history and preservation of American film, The Test of Time? And George, it is my belief that this book will pass the test of time. It is truly a first-rate piece of work. And for those of you who live in New York, on June 3rd, I will have the pleasure of interviewing George Stevens again in person before a screening of the magisterial A Place in the Sun.
oh,
My Place in the Sun.
And Foster,
place.
and Foster, I'm trained by Vicki Wilson. I've learned to also announce coming events. And 2 days later, on June the 5th, Tom Brokaw will interview me at the 92nd Street Y.
Oh,
beautiful,
And
great.
can I say one concluding thing? Because
Sure.
you learn things writing a book. And what I realized that I didn't fully understand before I wrote the book is that by the nature of my life, I have had, I wonder who has had more interesting colleagues and associates, from the world of entertainment, from government, from politics, from journalism, from publishing. And I would think that in the 37 years that I did the Kennedy Center Honors, we honored 188 of the greatest American performing artists. And to have all of these people in your life, and of course in Washington, assorted presidents, that really was the foundation of this book, just to kind of select from among those extraordinary engagements and find the stories that were worth telling. And all of their lives were involved with the test of time as well. So it was a happy thing to have done.
Thank you.
Thank you, George. Thank you so much for being with us. Thank you, Diane Baker, Millie Perkins. Wonderful to see you. Thank all of you for joining us. And Mark, I think we are going to call it a wrap at this point.
We shall. Thank you, everybody. And on behalf of the Lambs, thank you, Mr. Stevens.
Hey, thank you all. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
God bless
Good
you.
night, everyone.
God bless. Bye-bye.
Night.
Foster, you were wonderful.